So for the past few months, I've been suffering from insomnia. This is something that I've never had a problem with in the past. In fact, I have told people who have had trouble falling asleep in the past, friends of mine or ex-girlfriends, if you have trouble falling asleep at night, it's because you're not working hard enough during the day, right? You need to be working harder, you need to be exercising, you need to be eating right, you need to be doing what you know you need to do. Karma is a funny thing because now I have trouble getting to sleep just about every single night. And the reason I have trouble getting to sleep is because I go to sleep and I think about all the things that I need to do. If I'm really honest with myself, it's not just that my list of things I need to do is very long. Usually it's because I am failing to live up to the promises I've made myself. What sort of promises am I talking about? If you're a creative person, then you know to be creative in some sense is to feel this compulsion, this need to produce a body of work. With most creative work, you don't have a boss who's telling you, you need to start writing more consistently. You need to finish that book. You need to finish that album. Nobody's your boss in the world of creative work, right? I mean, there might be some special cases, but for the most part, these are projects that we're taking on for ourselves and projects that we kind of have to be our own boss for. And there are a lot of different creative things that I want to do. I want to write more consistently. I want to publish an album with my brother. I want to create more videos like this one. I want to build a body of work. The problem with having so many different avenues that I could potentially go into is I oftentimes get overwhelmed. A lot of that energy ends up becoming wasted. And a lot of times when you feel like energy is being wasted, you end up just doing nothing at all, or you end up procrastinating. One thing I've noticed is I'll get into this cycle where I'll say, you know what, I'm gonna be Superman today, and I'm going to just do everything, right? I'm gonna publish this article, I'm gonna finish this song, I'm gonna sit down and I'm gonna, make sure I practice at this thing. And then what ends up happening? I resolve to just grind harder for so many days, and then I get burnt out. And then it's right back to the cycle of non-action, right? And so for the purpose of this video, we're gonna call non-action inertia. Because what is inertia? Inertia is just a state where no force is being enacted on an object. As a creative, how do we overcome this state of inertia? The shortest answer I have for this is to simply reduce friction. I think it could be helpful for some of you out there who know you want to produce a body of work, but feel a bit overwhelmed and also feel like you're not able to consistently put out creative work. I recently moved into a new space, and the benefit of coming into a new space, especially a space that you can customize for yourself, is you have the benefit of getting to align that space. For example, if I set up my computer where I'm able to just hop on and just start writing or start live streaming, or I have my drum kit set up somewhere and I can just get straight into practicing or recording, that's a lower friction environment than, say, an apartment complex where I might have to set up and break down my drums every time I want to play. And also I have to worry about pissing off neighbors, and I got to worry about all these different things that might get in the way of me fulfilling creative action. A big buzzword in a lot of creative spaces now is this word flow. And flow is just essentially this state of creative action where you sort of forget yourself. The goal of reducing friction is to enter flow, or really to enter flow more readily. And when I talk about reducing friction, I'm talking about reducing mechanical friction, which we'll talk about here in a second, and also reducing mental friction. Friction is essentially those things that prevent you from getting into flow. Friction can really be any sort of inner or outer distraction, lack of information, a lack of discipline, a lack of space, lack of time, fear, doubt, insecurities. All of these things can congeal into something that prevents you from putting out more creative work. I'm sure at this point we've all heard the urban legend of Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs, how they wear the same t-shirt every single day, because the idea is decision making is in itself a sort of friction. It's something that prevents you from getting into the actual creative process. The clothing that I wear is not even going to take any amount of decision making energy from me, and I can just funnel all the rest of that energy into creative action. This is pretty smart when you think about it, because they're essentially saving up all of their bandwidth for things that actually take real energy, real thought, real decision making. And they're reducing friction at the things that can otherwise be automated, or the things that really aren't important for the creative process. And so when I talk about reducing friction, I'm essentially talking about doing this at scale, right? We don't have to all become as autistic as, say, Mark Zuckerberg, where we just wear the same t-shirt every day. I don't even think Mark Zuckerberg is that autistic anymore, but essentially, there are things you can do within your environment and also within your psyche to reduce friction. The first one is called mechanical friction. This makes up about 15% of a person's given friction in their environment at any given point in time. It's a small percentage of what's preventing you from creating, but a lot of times this is where I'll see people get hung up. Mechanical friction is one of the versions of friction that is the easiest to remedy. The main goal here is we don't want to seek to eliminate 100% of friction. Delaying creating because you're trying to eliminate all forms of friction is itself one of the worst forms of friction, which is perfectionism, which we'll get into later. But mechanical friction is a good place to start because it is so easy to remedy. Once you've eliminated this, it's easy to get the flywheel going, because that's the main thing is we just want to eliminate distractions and eliminate environmental factors that slow down the creative process or hinder it or interrupt it or what have you. So a lot of mechanical friction is related to material things. First of all, your space that you're doing your work in, like, is it conducive to creative action? Like, is the place that you write at very noisy or in a high traffic area in your home? I remember I had my computer set up somewhere in the kitchen and my wife would be cooking behind me. My cat would be crawling across my desk. It would very much interrupt my flow. It was a huge form of friction. Now I have an office where my computer is in one corner of the room. It's a totally empty corner and I have really no choice other than to write. And if my cat is annoying me or something like that, I just close the door. Imagine that. You can actually close the door and not have your cat interrupt you while you're writing. But it's not only that. For example, spatial friction can be related to, give you one example. So I drum a lot. And when I was living with my brother, I brought my drum kit into our apartment complex. The minute we started playing, our upstairs neighbor wanted to murder us. And of course, that makes a lot of sense because drums are very noisy, and when you're in an apartment complex, sometimes even a cat walking around too loudly can upset a particularly neurotic neighbor. Drumming with my usual drum kit was not something that would really work for that space. But what we did was buy an electric drum kit where it's just the tapping noises and I could wear headphones. It's not going to disrupt the neighbor. And also it's always plugged up, so there's no setting up, breaking down. That saves us probably 15 minutes every single time we want to jam. The electric drums were set up in my living room. I would walk out of my room, go sit in the living room at the drums, start drumming. My brother would hear me and then he would come out and we would start jamming. Like, he would have his bass and we could just start jamming immediately. That was one of the lowest friction points I've ever had for mine and my brother's band. Because shortly thereafter, I moved an hour away, and then any other time we wanted to jam together, either he would have to drive an hour or I would have to drive an hour. That right there, distance from creative partners, that's another form of friction. Anytime you can reduce one of these things, it's just going to help you get into the work a lot sooner. Because a lot of creatives, we work on what's called inspiration or motivation or whatever you want to call it. And when an idea hits you, you want to just be able to jump straight into the idea and start executing and translating the idea into something real. Other frictions that you might have, time. For example, before I was working from home, I would be trapped at the office all the time. That would severely limit the amount of time that I could actually practice the drums. What I did in that case was I just took my drumsticks to work with me, and then I would practice drumming on like a pad or something during my lunch break. Sometimes energy is the mechanical friction. I've always thought to myself, if I can keep my body fit, right, and I can get a lot of rest and I can make sure that I'm staying up to date on my nutrition, that's going to give me more energy throughout the day. It's going to make me a more vital human being, and it's going to allow me to just have more energy to pour into creative pursuits. So at all of these places, you are working with a budget, you're working with a time budget, you're working with an energy constraint. And really the main thing I want to impress to you guys here is with mechanical friction, don't get stuck trying to make things perfect, make your environment perfect, but just ask yourself, what are the unique advantages of my situation right now? And how could I set up my environment to aid the creative process and get rid of any things that might be hindering me from getting into creative flow? Now, the more difficult sort of friction to get rid of, this makes up about 85% of a person's friction at any given point in time, is mental friction. A lot of mental friction is wrapped up with our self-identity, and it takes a level of self-awareness to recognize that mental friction is going on. For example, you can have somebody who has an absolute perfect setup. In my case, I think I have a really good setup here. I can very easily record videos. I can very easily practice my drums. I have a ton of time on my hands. I have a ton of energy. And for whatever reason, I'm not doing the things that I know I could or should be doing creatively. A lot of it is due to procrastination. It's due to doubts, fears, whatever. So we're going to get into mental friction here and see if we can't remedy some of these things. Another thing is I've set these up in a sequential order. If you take care of these things in this order, it can help you diagnose what specific friction is preventing you from getting started. So like I said earlier, the first and easiest form of mental friction to get rid of is just outward distraction. So I think Jerry Seinfeld had the absolute best strategy when it came to eliminating outward and inner distraction. He would lock himself in a room and he said, I'm not going to force myself to write jokes. I'm not forced to write any jokes right now. However, I'm not allowed to do anything else. This is huge. He would have these note cards in front of him and he would just literally stare at the wall until he came up with a joke. And he wouldn't let himself out of the room until, some jokes were written. And essentially what you do is you just constrain the things that you're allowing yourself to do to a point where creative work is the only thing that you're allowing yourself to do in that moment. In my case, I could go and I could say from 6 to 7, I'm going to practice drums. And let's say it's 6 o'clock. I go and I sit down at my drums and I'm like, I really don't want to drum right now. I have to at least sit at my drum set from 6 to 7, even if I don't even drum. But that's the only thing I'm going to allow myself to do for that hour. Okay. Out of sheer boredom, you're going to get something done. You're going to practice, right? You're going to get something done. Another thing that I forgot to mention earlier was skill as a sort of mechanical friction, because let's say I have an idea for a beat in my head or a melody or something like that, but I don't actually have the technical skill to make it come out of my head and make my fingers actually make that sound. Skill in this case is the sort of mechanical friction. You need more practice. Think about it in terms of a language. I know what I want to say, but I might not know this foreign language well enough to communicate it fluently. I might have a crude translation, but over time and with practice, I can start translating things more fluently. Back to mental friction. So you've set aside the time and materials necessary. You might have even practiced to a point where you're pretty proficient at this certain creative skill. However, you're waiting on inspiration. You don't quite feel inspired to create. I had a buddy of mine, he's a very talented guy, and he asked me one time, he said, what should I create? What should I make? What should I make? That's not an honest question, right? I would rather somebody ask me, how do I create? Right? Because then we could talk about mediums, we could talk about techniques, we could talk about all sorts of things. Asking me what you should create betrays a lack of really wanting to create anything at all, or it betrays a sort of lack of discipline. A lot of times people like to romanticize this idea of the person who just gets hit with some angelic or even demonic message and just starts writing, and then this masterpiece comes out. But Sam Hyde said it best. He said, creative work is blue collar work. Like, you treat it like blue collar work. You show up, you put in the hours. In my opinion, discipline is far more inspiring than rapture. Matter of fact, I remember one time somebody came to me, as a student of mine, he came to me and he said, so how do I get over procrastination? And I just looked at him and I said, just work. Just do the thing. Like, I don't know how else to answer that question. You say you have a problem. Okay, the problem is you're not working. The answer is to work. We a lot of times like to romanticize the outcome. We even like to romanticize the process. There are people who want to be considered artists, but don't want to actually go through the pain and sweat to make themselves a great, piece of art. The mental friction that is one of the hardest to overcome. It's one of the most invisible, and it's one that I think most people get trapped by is pride. And what do I mean by this? What is pride? It's thinking too highly of yourself. I, for the longest time, prevented myself from creating anything at all because I had this perfect idealized version of what I wanted my work to come out to be, what I wanted people to think of my work, what I wanted people to think of me as a creator. Pride and perfectionism, they're the exact same problem. And it's thinking too highly of yourself. If you remember earlier, we said that to enter flow is to essentially enter into a state of effortless creation where you've totally forgotten yourself, right? You've lost yourself in the process. Pride is the complete opposite of that. Pride is thinking only of yourself in the creative process, thinking that your identity is somehow tied up with this thing you're creating. and thinking that the creator necessarily relies on creation. That's not how this works at all. And it's funny what pride does. Pride, it makes us think very highly of ourselves, but it also makes us feel very insecure. Not only does pride prevent us from creating things, but I think it prevents all of mankind from being creative. I don't think there's this class of people who is just above, the common man. I think that we call artists creative, but in truth, I think people who cook a good meal are in their own way creative, or I think people who are really good at selling, I think they are in their own way creative. I think people are just naturally creative. And so my main message here is to just reduce friction where you can in your creative process. If you feel that you're unsatisfied with your creative output, then chances are you need to reduce some friction. I've given you some tools here in this video, but I just want you to know, if you feel compelled to go out and create something now because you feel empowered, you feel like you've been given some tool to make creating easier, hey, I'm happy to hear that. I'm glad to hear that. Go make something right now. Turn off this video. But if after watching this video, you feel like you have to obsess over analyzing where there's friction in your process and how you can make it more efficient, and you feel like just overwhelmed by analysis paralysis, I'm begging you, forget everything I just said and just go make something.